Thank you very much for that very nice and warm introduction. And you're absolutely right. I have no, if you look at my track record in the BJS, I still have a lot to do to convince you. It's a great privilege to be here, but more importantly, it's an amazing thing to be celebrating here the centenary of a journal, a paper journal, at a time in which the whole media is thinking about the future of paper publications. And in many ways, it really demonstrates the value and the contribution that the British Journal of Surgery has made, but more importantly, the leadership, the society, and I'll really like to congratulate the board, the editorial board, the editor, and many, many of the previous editors. It does take a team effort to get a journal of this nature to where it is, but more importantly also, its impact factor increasing by the year. My task is to share with you a little bit, sort of moving on from the research and to talk about the innovation end. And I think it's be worthwhile to remind ourselves the contribution of innovation, technological innovation, over the last century, and certainly the surgical role in that innovation. And I think we've heard two very eloquent speakers, what surgery has done. I think it's in most cases undervalued, if I could say that, by many, many sectors. Surgery hasn't really been in the limelight and pushing the boundaries or boasting for surgery, if I could use that word. But in 100 years, I don't think there's any other sector that could actually claim that they had such an impact on humanity, doubling life expectancy. And there are many, many innovations up there. I think what's unique about that slide also is in the early part of that century, every family was spending about twice on funerals than they were on healthcare. And towards the end of that century, as you will know, in this country, we're spending about 8.3% of our GDP on healthcare. And I think if you cross the Atlantic, they're spending about 18% of their GDP on healthcare and rising, with huge challenges when it comes to the return on every pound or every dollar spent. And if you are in policy, you will come to think that, how am I going to deal with this big challenge? Now, something else happened in that century, and that is surgery, as clearly demonstrated earlier, added many, many years to our lives, where the challenge is the next 50 or 100 years is how we're going to add years to these lives. Which brings me back to, how do you improve access to healthcare? How do you improve quality of healthcare? And how do you improve the effectiveness or the cost effectiveness of healthcare? And the definition you come with is innovation. Whether that is innovation in healthcare, whether that is innovation with some of the big major challenges facing us, climate change, energy, it's no different. So let's get back into a little bit of definition. And that's really what the BJS will teaches you, is definition, clarity, scope. What is innovation? And it's fascinating because in my university, when I mention the word innovation, the first thing everyone talks about is the number of patents that I've produced or the number of papers that are published in the British Journal of Surgery. That is the perception of the university, what innovation is all about. There's more to that than that. Innovation is about the implementation of some of the technologies that we've seen previously contributed by surgeons and continue to, or services or processes or even business models that actually adds value. And that's in many ways is the clarity that Clay Christensen has brought in from the Harvard Business School. And some of these are breakthrough, disruptive, and we heard some of these in cardiac surgery, but most of the surgical innovations have been incremental. And again, we've seen that in the cardiac surgical example, and I will come back to that. Intermittently, you get the odd orthogonal innovation, and that is something invented to be used in somewhere in the other, and has been used in other parts or other disciplines of surgery. And I think the one that has been talked about as a breakthrough innovation, certainly, which has had a disruptive impact on my career, has been minimally invasive or laparoscopic surgery. And if you go back, and this is the bit that I'd really like to focus on today, is why does it take such a long time? In 1954, Hopkins came up with the Hopkins rod lens. He was actually an Imperial, a reader. They didn't get on with him. He packed his bag and went to Reading, a bit closer to here, and that's where he came up with the Hopkins rod lens. And it was about 30 years later that that technological innovation disrupted the way in which surgery is delivered. And that was really, in many ways, the creation of laparoscopic surgery. Now, within those 2 or 3 years, there was an interesting phenomena, and that is, if I could use it back to the example of cardiac surgery, because I could predict what Rob might be talking about, because some fascinating examples in there, is a lot of us, including me in our department, we were talking about the incremental innovation that is required to laparoscopic surgery or thoracoscopic surgery to achieve, in many ways, the concept of taking away, putting a patient on a heart and lung machine. And this was a wacky idea. This is using the imaging on both the right and the left eye of the robots, funded by the EPSRC. What we wanted to do is, could we find a way, by tracking the eye movements of the surgeon and looking at their fixation point, we can actually measure the depth of the tissue that the surgeon is looking at. If we have the tissue characteristics of a beating heart by a preoperative MRI, we can have the right algorithm, and we can get the scope, if you like, to beat at the same speed as that beating heart. And this is what I'm talking about. We all have a fixation point, we have a conversion, and we converge. We have this case contingent way of measuring the depth, and then we can, in the background, then try to move the scope at the same rate as the beating heart, and you have a static image displayed to the surgeon. You know, we really thought this is it. We did our experimental work. A lot of money went into this. Fantastic. But, and this brings you back into how you keep up in what's around you. And back to the example, and again, if I could use Clay Christensen's way of approaching it, there were a number of incremental innovations. Intensive care, better cardiac surgery. We thought we're going to make a contribution in this gaze contingent motion compensation. A lot of work and money went into it, but at the same time, there was one big, big disruption, which is about to happen to cardiac surgery as a whole, which we haven't really touched on, and that was the concept of angioplasties and a stent. That came from the left side. Surgery was not ready for that disruption. Similarly, as surgery was not ready in the era of gastrectomies to the proton pump inhibitors. And it always gets you from the side. Now, what's interesting about disruption and disruptive innovations, and surgery has driven some of that, is in many cases, it's actually replacing an expensive procedure. Cardiac surgery is expensive, angioplasty is cheap, it requires cardiologists, whatever you think they are, whatever they claim they are less and significantly less experienced or intuitive than cardiac surgeons are. But they certainly fill the market and expanded at that market, and there's significantly lesser morbidity and mortality. So that's technological innovation, and that's been, if you like, me. I'm a failed engineer. You've heard and you've read about this, and I've always aspired to be an engineer. Somehow or the other ended up in medical school. But that's the type of work, and I think surgery has many, many examples of innovations, and the challenge we have is how do we hardwire some of our new residents coming through in really thinking that way. And I think the most successful center has been, what I've seen, has been the Biodesign Center in Stanford. I don't know if you've seen those, really bringing groups of people together. We're trying to catch up in many ways in Imperial, and I think in Oxford they're trying to do the same. The bit that we miss out on, and I think in many ways it brings you back into what is, where does surgery sit in the research excellence framework? And this is something we go through in this country every 5 years. I think we should ask us another question here. Where does other innovation goes as far as surgical research? Process innovation. We've seen an example of this. Atul Gawande's work, I had the privilege of working with him, a simple checklist, 19 indicators, evidence-based, have been around for 15 to 20 years. It's about 45 pence is what the cost of this thing is. What does it do? It does have a huge impact in reducing the morbidity and mortality of surgery. The challenging thing about all of this is actually, we've just completed a study looking at the uptake of the surgical checklist. Sadly, some of the cultural and behavioral issue is becoming a tick-of-the-box exercise rather than actually doing it for the right reason or the right purpose. So there is an innovation introduced, not necessarily the right way, is generating some other challenges. I think business model innovation is another interesting one. We don't see much of that in surgery. I'll give you with one example, but what's happening when a science or a scientific disruption comes in, and in many ways, it tends to disrupt the way healthcare is delivered. What used to happen in an academic, well, whatever, a major teaching hospital now is done by DGH, what DGH is done at primary health. And similarly, how do you disrupt the workforce? It's not going to be tomorrow that we're going to have a non-surgeon doing a surgical procedure. But at some stage, we need to be ready for that fact that there are certain interventional aspects of a procedure that could be done by a non-surgeon. Which brings me back to the business model. And this is something that's been extremely successful in the US. Many surgeons have led business model innovations. And again, do not undervalue. That is science in itself in differentiating provision from what we have, which is a district general hospital, everything in one site, which has many, many advantages, into elective treatment centers. And we tried that here in this country a few years ago. But I think the challenge there was a political one, where they were shifting the practice into privately owned and run providers rather than actually separation of acute from elective surgery. So, brings me back to the challenges. And what are the challenges of the future? Certainly in this country, and I think with the leadership of the British Journal of Surgery, in many aspects, there are, I think, still opportunities of inventions and disruptions. And let's not forget Barclay Moynihan's, the godfather of British Journal of Surgery's textbook in 1934, with the opening statement was, there is nothing more that needs to be discovered, that could be discovered in surgery. And I think there is significantly more that surgery could do and contributes to. In this country, we've sorted more or less, I think with the help of Norman and many academic leaders in this room, the translational research aspect. There are more clinical trials happening in surgical practice. There are more patients being recruited into clinical trials, certainly in this country. What remains a challenge is the uptake, is how do you translate the evidence into clinical practice? And then how do you scale that up at a population level? And that is and remains a major challenge. Interestingly enough, that challenge isn't unique for surgery. It's actually unique in healthcare if you compare them in any other sector. There's a big chunk that is lost in the translation between the evidence base that is created and that clinical practice. And that gap is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, despite what the leadership of the British Journal of Surgery. And I think in many ways, I think one of the challenges for us, if we're contributing to the BJS, is what is the BJS's role in really closing that gap, which is the social media aspect, if you like, of the British Journal of Surgery. There are many obstacles you hear about, one of which was the National Institute of Clinical Health Excellence. Some of you who come from the US would know it as the death panels that we run in the UK. What the NICE is there is purely to do a technology appraisal, but in actual fact, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence activity in technology appraisal is only 20% of its overall activity. 80% of its activity is to come up with sound, evidence-based clinical guidelines. However, there's a big separation what NICE says and where we are in clinical practice. If you look at the number of appraisals actually that they do, and this includes not just drugs, actual fact, they are a bit more, it's more complicated to do device assessment, but at the same time, they're not as strict in stopping devices. But this is a percentage-wise of the unrestricted and the optimized. In other words, 84% of their advice is recommend the use of. But out of that 84%, sadly, the system in this country only implements 20% of that output. So you can see the gap still is the gap between what we know and what we do, rather than the gap of what we need to know. Which brings me back to what are these challenges? I mean, I talked about NICE. There are budget issues, which keeps coming up, reimbursement, I think the one challenge in surgery is decommissioning. We commission new services, but rarely we actually decommission many other services that we've been either driving or whether these are technology or procedures and others. And I'm going to finish off with a few words about what's happening in the rest of the world. This was a piece of work that we led, published in The Lancet about a year ago, which was a commission, which is to look at innovations in healthcare and mostly technological innovations in the developing world. And the driver for that was some early evidence that there are innovations that are coming down from the southern and the eastern hemisphere rather than the traditional innovations that are coming from the northern and the western hemisphere. And this description of frugal innovation, and I remember this about 3 or 4 years ago, I had to actually open up the dictionary to find out what frugal was. Apparently some of us live frugal. This is about frugal innovation, which in many ways is, for me was a mindset change where, I spent most of my life doing high cost, low impact innovation like robotics. And these guys are thinking of low cost, high impact innovations, which is in a completely different sphere. And most of that, again, was based on simple process innovations, new business models, and they were driven by their local challenges in really setting up new healthcare systems in these emerging economies and the developing world. And one thing they've learned, do not make some of the mistakes that we've made here. And what's unique about frugal innovation, which is very, very important, is it should be at the same quality as the standard innovations we're doing now. So their principles and the values where they're coming from are no different than others. It's purely, from their perspective, is the cost and the scaling up. So it needs to be world-class in quality, it needs to be affordable, and it needs to be scalable. Now you put those three outside the Department of Surgery at Imperial and say, what do you need to do to change your thinking? And actually driving that. It's fascinating what sort of reaction you get from many, many members of staff, from very junior to very, very senior. And there are examples of this. This is not just happening in the developing world. And this is a piece of work that I had the fortune of leading at the World Economic Forum, which was presented in Davos a couple of years ago, which we picked case studies of these frugal innovations, which included surgical examples here and there of what's happening in that world. And one example was the Ara Eye Care Center. I mean, commonly used. It's a fascinating case study. The technological innovation they come up with was a lens of equal quality to the cataract lens that we have for $5. They do 250,000 cataracts a year. It's interesting, their business model, 20% that they charge funds 80% that cannot pay. And what's unique about this, I love this when I present this in Moorfield, which is our eye hospital, the margins per case or the return on the investment is greater than what Moorfields make. So there is something there that is happening which is very different and very, very unique. So back to surgery, I think back to the British Journal of Surgery, and in many ways, when you talk about change, when you talk about innovation, why is surgery here? Surgery is here because it continues to drive innovation, and the British Journal of Surgery is here because it continues to change itself and really have the regard to all aspects of surgical research, because as Rob very eloquently said, what is surgical research? The way I see it is surgery providing the leadership to that change and that innovation. So again, thanks for having me. Thank you.